Well, you touched on something really interesting here, talking about controlling your IP and being able to determine what rights you have and what you want to distribute. And if you flatten all the files and send them off to record label XYZ, that's one thing. But what happens, I mean, have you folks ever been asked for stems, for example, for a music mix? Anybody else been asked for stems? What do? Do you give it to them?
Not if we can help it.
Why?
Well, because they can just remix it without me.
George, do you want to address this?
Well, were you at the meeting, at Allison's meeting a couple weeks ago, John? The new policy of BMG Nashville is to ask all producers to provide stems. Now, this is policy that's currently being implemented because right now producers are refusing to do stems. So they're in the position of maybe having to make that part of the contract the next time and seeing if they can get producers to sign on. And that's exactly why they want to do it.
And they're going to try. I mean,
and they're going to try to do it.
Very adamant about that.
So the question becomes whether we will, as an industry, be able to resist that and take a stand. I mean, I will because I won't work for BMG. They're thugs and idiots. But other people might have to.
Sorry.
No, I'm proud.
Backspace. How do we erase that?
No.
Okay.
We still have a First Amendment, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, part of the issue becomes how do you control your intellectual property? I mean, if you give away all of your files, people can recombine them, and not only do you not have control, you don't get credit for it, and ultimately you don't get paid for it. Maureen?
But aren't there other reasons in Nashville you're talking about that because it's taking you more time to do it, that you're not getting paid to do it as well? And what about the issue of not about different backups, like the producers and the engineers backup that has your intellectual property that doesn't get handed to the label? Aren't people starting to do that as well?
No. If by what you mean the plug-in question is not being delivered to the labels at the agreement between A&R admin and producers. I mean that's a huge issue and one that's never been resolved. And I don't think we found it resolvable. Especially going forward, it may be pointless to try to resolve plugins when going forward, leaping forward 10 years and 15 years, plugins are not going to be compatible with something in the archive. That you really want, you prefer to have the flattened file only. But we're off track here. Just addressing the STEM issue, I'm not sure that it's really credible for the record company to make a stand that they're as good at making a mix from stems as we might be under the artist supervision, under producer supervision. I don't think that's credible, and I think we should resist it.
Well, I'm not being a producer and engineer, I certainly believe in the intellectual property of engineers, and I think that the STEM issue is one that will continue to be a thorn, something that will be worked out. But there's also proposed legislation currently in the Senate and House of Representatives with respect to performers getting paid as well. And much like is currently the way it happens in the European Union. And this again is another issue not relating necessarily to intellectual property, but relating to getting paid. And to me, the STEM issue and the performer information are still there. There are a couple of, shall we say, ill-defined revenue streams that we have to address going forward.
And this ties in neatly with the metadata project that you're working on. Obviously, in the EU, metadata relates to who performed on the project, who produced, who engineered, when was it done, who gets paid ultimately. That's where this whole thing ties together.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
How are you differentiating between a flattened file and a stem?
A flattened file is essentially a file that's a single file that's re-recorded with plugins.
Right.
So you just render that file with plugins in place, whereas a stem may be a series of guitar tracks that are mixed in stereo, or maybe a drum submix, or maybe a vocal submix.
Actually, not exactly. There are actually three things we're talking about. You're talking about a flattened file which has all edits resolved. You now have a contiguous, called the left justified file. You have a bounce, The bounced file is a file that is flattened and also has level rights, automation, all plugins, and just appears as a generic WAV file.
Connie, were you going to throw in?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's much more, yeah.
Jack, there was one phrase that was mentioned before, virtual multitrack. It's not. Virtual multitracks don't have defined EQ, they don't have the automation. So
Well, occasionally they would cut with reverb or bounce with reverb, so it's not, yeah.
But you couldn't put the multitrack up and just
Right.
play it and there with your minutes.
Right. Well, it's really a term I use because I think, I mean, I like to use the example of and these guys have heard this twice already, so forgive me. The Beatles anthologies, you know, that was an enormous revenue stream for EMI, and it worked because EMI could go into the archives, pull out the original tapes, put them into Pro Tools or whatever they used, Sonic, I think maybe they used at that time, and, you know, cut together the different versions, right? And that's because those tapes existed, and they could find them and they could play them back, and that's really what we're looking for, is that kind of ability to save our assets and repurpose them later.
Well, that's fine, and
Save
you talk
our
about five
assets.
files and nothing more.
Save our assets.
That's my intellectual
Yeah.
property. You talk about
Yeah.
5 files and nothing more, but that's not what the record companies want. They need to do karaoke, they need to do rock band, they need to do whatever they want.
Well, and I guess I would turn it back to you and say, obviously you have very strong feelings about this in terms of how it impacts you financially and economically, and this is just one of those things that, you know, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer for it, and you have to be in a proactive dialogue with whomever you're working with and be willing to either accept or walk away from that particular project with respect to the intellectual property that you are or are not giving away.
Oh, yeah.
Would
It's
you
gonna be a
agree?
compromise.
Yeah.
That's several levels of compromise, but
Multiple levels of compromise.
You know, it's worth mentioning working for Hollywood film companies. Generally, you sign over everything. You give them stems. That's what they expect. That's what you expect. And end of story. They get everything. And they own. Believe me, they own everything, including publishing. When you sell a song to film companies. So we know it can be done. We know it's something that we do. But there's that issue of artist intent. That if we really, if we're still charmed by the idea of doing great recording work, there's that issue of artist intent, that the artist really should be able to review his or her work before it goes out. And with the record company doing a final mix, we're getting quite possibly a good mix, but as likely to be a bad mix or a ham-handed mix, again referring to BMG, loathsome company if there ever was one, it's not going to be artist intent at all.
Question, Larry.
The issue of stems is sort of acquired a bad reputation for reasons I sort of understand, but I think it should be made clear that forget the issue of labels remixing what you do. I think in terms of the setup you have, whether it involves outboard gear, whether it involves mixing a box or a hybrid, the idea that you sit down and you're mixing this thing that's taking weeks, months, years of your life, and there's no downside to mixing the stems. I mean, there really isn't, because you can make the stems feed your monitor such that the 2-track mix you do is exactly those stems, and they are one. I mean, that's the way I do films. They are the same thing. There's no difference between the print master and the stems. There's literally no difference. It's just one is a sum of the other. And so, you know, again, aside from the issue of, you know, intellectual property and labels screwing with your work down the line, I think everybody should do stems, because this way, 10 years later, if you have an LCR drums and an LCR with everything baked in that you did, and you want to change something, the chance of your being able to, for you to go back and change it, there's going to be a snap, you know. And there's no
We're talking about
downside.
two different things.
What's that?
Well, we're talking about delivering stems and holding stems for you to use in your work.
Yeah, yeah.
Delivering stems to a record company is
Right, but I think people have a thought of stems.
right. Stems aren't bad in and of
Yeah.
themselves. They're not
Yeah,
bad.
yeah.
Yeah, there are a number of producers that we know that will deliver the virtual multitrack that Conrad was referring to, and then keep in their private archive will keep the stems
Yeah.
for revisions.
Can I just make one other quick point? you know, the way I see it, and the reason I use that terminology for virtual multitrack, and people have taken me on for that before, is for you know, the students I have, these young kids, you know, they've grown up with computers, they're fairly cavalier about data and using it, and it's really changing the way of thinking. It's, you know, I mean, what can we say, 95% of what's recorded, you know, probably doesn't need to be saved, but how do we identify the 5% that does need to be saved? And we do need to save it. So the approach is to change the thinking and say, you're doing this for the long term. What do you have to do to ensure that this data stays alive for the long term? Because we can see you can make millions of dollars off of some of this stuff later on.
Question?
Hi, I'm really learning a lot from this, but the reason I came to this is, are there any recommendations for what formats are going to survive?
You're reading my mind. That's where we're going next.
It's like Friends Hop.
Ah, yeah.
Call me now.
Yeah, and don't order the shrimp tonight. It's like your friend's house. Sorry.